There are three infamous topics that you're not supposed to talk about at the dinner table: sex, politics, and religion. Being the defiant, rabble-router adolescent that I am, I'm going to speak about one of these forbidden subjects: politics. Buckle your seatbelts. Some people love our political process. Some people hate it. And some people are so disinterested that they think the Electoral College is some type of graduate school up in Massachusetts. As I'm sure you've all noticed, our current political climate is contentious, to say the least. It seems as if every time I check my phone, there's about 10 CNN notifications regarding some crazy phenomenon occurring on Capitol Hill. We have half the country donning red Make America Great Again hats, with the other half sporting pink pussycat beanies. Actually, slightly more than half if we're acknowledging that final majority vote. As far as my involvement in politics goes, if you'd asked me 2 years ago if I were a liberal or a conservative, I probably would have given you a different answer each time you asked, because I honestly had no clue what either label meant. However, as this unique campaign and election unfolded, I found it impossible to stay uninvolved. It was pretty easy for me to pick a candidate when it came down to choosing one. I'm a young Latina female and the granddaughter of 2 Mexican immigrants. I'll let you figure out which candidate I supported. I was emotional when those election results came in. The whole country was. Whether you were wearing red or blue, it was a dramatic couple of days. I'm a senior here at San Dieguito Academy, and those tense sentiments were just as evident amongst teenagers here too. The term teenager is often associated with shallowness, immaturity, and unawareness. Adolescents' opinions are often disregarded under the justification that they're too young to know what they're talking about. I mean, we can't vote, right? How much could we possibly know or care about our government? What impact could a bunch of minors have on our political spectrum? It turns out that when teenagers are given the proper guidance and education to form developed political ideologies, they can have a significant impact. Here's what proved that to me. As I mentioned earlier, the 2016 election results left me feeling disheartened and frightened for the future. This was exacerbated by the fact that I wasn't old enough to vote. I felt powerless and insignificant. I couldn't participate in this process. All I could do was sit back and watch the events unfold around me. Or so I thought. I found that many of my peers shared similar emotions. We were struggling to find a way to have our opinions recognized and respected. The manner in which I tried to achieve this political acknowledgement was controversial. Some of you might feel uncomfortable or disapproving, and you might want to start tuning me out. However, I encourage you to stay with me and listen to the end. I, along with 2 of my peers, planned a school-wide walkout to protest Donald Trump 2 days after he was elected. I'll spare you all the details of the nuts and bolts that went into planning such an event, an initiative that chaotically played out in less than 12 hours, but here's the gist of it. I was absolutely terrified in every moment of every juncture of the planning, execution, and aftermath. I was terrified for a number of reasons. First, I was scared that nobody would show up and that this proposed walkout would amount to no more than half a dozen of us meandering around outside, pitifully trying to make a political statement. Then, ironically, I was scared by the magnitude of people who said they would show up, because we quickly received word that there were community members and students from other schools, such as LCC, who were planning on attending. I was scared that this would be seen as a ploy to attract attention, or one of those stereotypical teenage acts of defiance. We received a slew of negative, disrespectful, and flat-out offensive comments via social media, and I was scared that it would turn violent. Most of all, I was scared that we would not be taken seriously because we were just adolescents. Okay, so that was a lot of angst and negativity. I also just happened to be an extremely nervous and panicky person in general, so that did not help the situation. But that aside, the walkout was a huge success by all accounts. Mine, protesters, counter-protesters, teachers, school administration, even non-participants. It exceeded all of our expectations. Although, if I'm being candid, we really didn't know what to expect. At 1 o'clock, we silently filed out of our classrooms and gathered in the area right outside this building. And once we got there, we simply talked. I and the 2 other organizers invited students one by one to stand before the crowd and just talk about how they were feeling, why they decided to participate. This wasn't solely protesters either. Counter-protesters spoke as well. And we created a dialogue where students were listening to the opposing viewpoints and viewing things from a different perspective. Protesters expressed their fears for the rights of minorities. Counter-protesters expressed their will for less division. Everybody listened, acknowledged, and respected the voices of everybody, regardless of if they agreed or disagreed. Do you guys, it was peaceful, it was unifying, it was enlightening. Do you guys realize that this is something that many adults in our society, in our government, are unable to accomplish? Our walkout was covered by several local newspapers. We had students coming up to us days after the event to tell us that they were so glad that they participated. Both students who had supported the idea from the beginning and students who had vehemently opposed it initially. Our principal, Bjorn Page, actually wrote an editorial in a local newspaper to oppose the community critics of the event and express how pleased and proud he was of how the walkout was executed. Okay, so the point of this speech isn't to convince you that you should love or hate the walkout or that you should agree or disagree with a certain political affiliation. The factor that I want to focus on is this conglomeration of teenagers who used their political voices that day. Most of us couldn't vote. Our brains are technically still undeveloped. Sometimes we do dumb things like the cinnamon challenge or the Kylie Jenner lip challenge. But look at what teens were able to accomplish that day. These kids were politically knowledgeable. They were informed and educated enough to make well-supported opinions for themselves. They were mature enough to view things from a different perspective and see issues in a different angle. That kind of appreciation and insight regarding the touchy subject that is politics stems directly from guidance from you all, from our parents, our teachers, and our mentors. The way in which you view, discuss, and participate in politics directly affects how we grow to view, discuss, and participate in politics. It's akin to when your child was a toddler and they were first beginning to explore talking, and you all of a sudden began to hear them repeating the words and phrases that you tended to use. This is often met with both pride and fear. That same process occurs in our political socialization. I'll explain with a few examples. I can't tell you how many times I've come across a peer who claims to be a Democrat or a Republican, but when asked why, it's solely because their parents are Democrats or Republicans, and they're choosing to identify themselves the same way without having any real knowledge about either party. There are so many teenagers who simply don't care about politics, and it's because their parents don't pay attention to that stuff. This kind of blind following without any self-motivated research is so dangerous to both individuals and society. But I think this walkout is a prime example of how adults can foster teens' political ideologies in the right way. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're saying to yourself, my teen doesn't listen to anything I tell them. They don't want to hear me preach about political engagement. But trust me, there are ways in which you, parents, can slyly educate and inform your child. Even small things can have a big impact. Tune in to the televised political proceedings every once in a while. Watch the debates together, or the press conferences, or the Senate hearings. Talk about the way that our government functions, the different positions, the different viewpoints. When your ballot arrives in the mail, look over the measures and the props together as a family. Talk about the pros and cons of voting one way versus the other. It can even be as simple as visiting historical museums where we can learn about the foundation of our government and the different people, values, and events that made it what it is today. Generate thought, generate questions, generate interest. That alone will help encourage teens to be much more invested in our political system. Teachers also play a huge role in our political socialization. Personally, I know that my own political beliefs are derived from the notes that I took in AP US History class, or the AP English language essays that I wrote, or the American government class discussions that I partake in. Now, that isn't to say that my teachers are standing in front of the whiteboard yelling, "Trump is a deplorable," or "Hillary for prison." Rather, teachers can show us the importance of developing a well-supported opinion. They can provide forums for effective discussion. They can teach us about how to be participants in our political system and not just observants. Making politics less of a detached foreign concept and more of a familiar and comfortable process will in turn make for more active and educated voters in the future. Because remember, kids don't stay kids forever. A lot of us high schoolers will be voting in those next 2018 midterm elections. So that brings me to my final point. Why is it so important for teens to be politically knowledgeable? According to a poll conducted by the Center for Information and Research on Civic Engagement, of the eligible voters between the ages of 18 and 29, only half of them voted in this past 2016 election. Isn't that crazy? We live in a country where we are fortunate enough to enjoy the privilege of participating in this democratic system, and yet half of the eligible millennial voters chose to ignore that privilege. This disengagement would be drastically improved if there is a stronger push for teenagers to be more politically educated, aware, and active. So let's circle back to that initial question. What impact can minors have on our political system? Well, walkouts like the one I mentioned here at SDA occurred all across the country. There was a nationwide wave of teenagers who may not have been old enough to vote, but still held very real opinions and investment in our government. We even made Donald Trump's Twitter page. Never underestimate what a mishmash group of educated, passionate teenagers are capable of. Never underestimate the impact that you, adults, have on us, kids, and thus the impact that we can have on the world. Thank you.